Hello, everyone. My name is Eric Walsh, and I currently serve as the Assistant Director of Assessment and Research at the University at Buffalo. The title of this presentation is Marie Kondo Your Data, and it focuses on the concept of tidy assessment. In God we trust, all others bring data. This quote is commonly attributed to the late W. Edwards Deming. But a few years ago, the famous statistician and political scientist Simon Jackman used this quote to describe the essence of what he referred to as the data revolution. But what exactly do we mean when we say the data revolution? First of all, the data revolution is not simply big data. And this is particularly important for those of us in higher education because we simply don't have big data in higher ed. Certainly, we can aggregate our data into larger and larger data sets, but this pales in comparison to the petabytes and zettabytes of data at Google and Amazon. The data revolution also does not refer to the computing power or the new tools that we have for data manipulation, data visualization, and statistical modeling. These tools are just that. They are tools that help us do our work, but they will never replace sound research design and rigorous analysis. No, as Simon Jackman points out, the data revolution is about the reinvigoration of an idea that dates back to the Enlightenment. It's about the reinvigoration of the idea that when we make an argument, we need evidence. We need data to support that argument. In God we trust, all others bring data. This notion, though, raises another key question that we have to grapple with. If we must bring data, what do we bring? Imagine, if you will, that you are packing for a vacation. The first thing that you do is pull out your big suitcase and start setting aside things that you would like to bring with you. First, you pack some maps for the place that you're about to visit. Maybe one for a walking tour of the city so you can see all the great architecture. Then you add in some guidebooks to help you enjoy some of the great museums that you're going to visit while you're in the new city. After that, you add your binoculars so you can see the sights off in the distance, or maybe even do some bird watching while you're on your trip. After that, you add a swimsuit and goggles in case you want to do some swimming or happen to go to the beach. Then after that, you add some hiking gear and some camping equipment so you can explore the great outdoors and sleep out under the stars. And then, just to be safe, you add some skis and ski poles and a winter coat and a winter hat, just in case you happen to wind up at a ski resort and want to hit the slopes. Of course, that idea would be absurd. The idea that you would start packing for a trip without knowing where you're going or what you will need doesn't make any sense. The point is, though, that whenever you add something that you didn't need, it takes up space, and there is less room for the things that you do need to bring with you. The trouble is that this very same thing can happen with our assessment efforts. Think about some of the ways that we approach surveying our students. When we add more and more surveys to our survey calendar, our response rates plummet, and we crowd out some of our most important efforts. When we add more and more questions to our survey, we run the risk that our respondents will give up halfway through and not even make it to the most important questions on the instrument. When we ask our students to provide information that we already have, or ask them for information that we ultimately won't use, we make it more difficult to gather data from them in the future. This is where the notion of tidy assessment comes into play. I'm paraphrasing a bit, but those of you that have seen the popular Netflix show are probably familiar with this idea from Marie Kondo. Only keep items that spark joy. The notion of tidy assessment relies on a very similar principle. Only collect data that sparks action. So often, we collect data because we believe that we need to make data-driven decisions. The trouble is that we don't always think clearly about how the data will impact our decisions, what data we already have at our disposal, and what approach will provide us with the most insightful information. This is where the principles of tidy assessment can help. So here are the core principles of tidy assessment. First, understand your burden of proof. Second, know what you already have and only collect what you need. And last but not least, refine your research methods to ensure that the data you collect will answer your research question. The most important principle for tidy assessment is understanding your burden of proof. Oftentimes, we fall into the trap of collecting data simply because it is interesting. The trouble is that even if data is interesting, it's not necessarily actionable. As a result, it is essential that we be clear and specific about our burden of proof. What do the results need to look like to convince you that you are right? What do the results need to look like to convince you to make a change? Go through this exercise with each new research question and be as specific as possible. If you cannot clearly state your burden of proof ahead of time, there is a good chance that you won't be able to use the data to make decisions after the fact. Conducting tidy assessment projects also requires that we collect data as efficiently as possible. Oftentimes, we just immediately start collecting data before we take a look at what we have. Instead, begin by taking stock of the data that you already have access to. Higher education institutions have a wealth of data, and there is no reason to gather data that we already have. Instead, think about how you can connect any of the data that you already have to any new data that you collect. We have tremendous tools that can help us join data sets and link data, and these tools can help us cut down on the amount of new data that we need to gather. Lastly, in order to conduct tidy assessment, we need to refine our research methods. At times, we have a tendency to revert to conducting surveys because that is what we're familiar with. The trouble is that surveys cannot help us answer every research question. Sometimes a survey is not the most appropriate tool. Instead, we can incorporate other methodological approaches into our practice, and we can often come up with a better answer. For example, the literature on randomized field experiments can show us how to embed assessment directly into the design of our programs and interventions. This allows us to assess the effectiveness of these programs without collecting new data. Instead, we rely on good research design and the data that we already collect. In closing, it's important to note that tidy assessment does not only benefit us as assessment professionals. The concept can also benefit our students. On this slide are a handful of quotes from our students from this spring semester. With all that was going on, our students were very clear about what they were feeling. In what was probably the most hectic semester that any of them had ever experienced, they were telling us that they were tired, that they were overwhelmed, and that they were stressed. As a result, we have a responsibility to our students to ensure that we are collecting data in the most efficient way possible. We also have the responsibility to ensure that any data that we collect is being leveraged to its full potential. So go forth and remember the principles of tidy assessment. Thank you for listening.